So as mentioned in the reminder email for the meeting, we're going to be focusing on ingest workflows and staging areas. And so we've had three folks from the group volunteer to lead talks on these. So Luke Menzies, the head of digitization and digital preservation at UAB Libraries, the University of Alabama, Birmingham, is here. I think Luke's going to be going first, and then Dan Noonan, associate professor and digital preservation librarian at University Libraries at Ohio State University, is here as well. And Scott Prater, who's the digital library architect at UW Digital Collections Center, University of Wisconsin-Madison, is here as well. So all three of them will be presenting short talks on their workflows. And again, thank you for volunteering to do that. I don't know, I'm trying to think if there's any other housekeeping or anything else you wanted to mention before we get started. We'll have time, hopefully, around the end for questions. Robin, is there anything else you wanted to mention before we get started?
I don't think so. We should probably reiterate the date of the next meeting at the end, but
Okay. Yeah. That sounds good, right? Okay. Sorry. We can go over the other meeting dates and everything. Okay. All right. Well, without further ado, Luke, do you want to go ahead and get started? Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to share screen. Is it working? Can you see my slide? Okay, cool. So hi, I'm Luke Menzies, head of digitization and digital preservation at UAB, and I volunteered for this not because my workflows are, the authority or anything like that, but really because I love talking about this stuff and always open to ideas. And, it's kind of the nature of workflows. You tweak them as you go. You adapt them to the needs of what you're trying to do. So before I run through the specific kind of step-by-step of the workflow, I wanted to just sort of hit on some questions because I kind of love theory, and I think that I like to have an idea of what we're trying to accomplish and why, kind of before going about figuring out what tools we need to make it happen. So the overall questions that drive our workflow development at UAB, one, how do we implement OAIS? I'm sure most, if not all, of the people on the call have seen this OAIS diagram. How do we structure our APEs? How do we minimize risk? What tools do we use? So the logic here is basically I assume that our archival information packages are kind of the ultimate goal. We want those to preserve as much data as possible. We want them to be, perfect as much as possible. And consequently, I think the ingest process is the absolutely most important part of the process, because access is super important. But if we don't, it's that phrase people say, garbage in, garbage out. If we make sure that what we're ingesting is what we want to be ingesting, then preserving it, keeping it long term makes sense. Let's see. So, I already said ingest is most crucial. I really see that as it's not only the most important, but it's also the place where the most risk happens. We have the most risk of data loss when we're transferring things, or not capturing date time metadata, for example. If we miss it, or if we somehow don't capture it or preserve it well. There's just a lot of risk in that ingest stage. And another kind of concepts that drive us is, I like to say, if it's not documented, consistent, and standards compliant, then I don't want to hear about it. And so as much as possible, we try to document everything. We try to apply everything consistently, because even if you make a mistake or if you have an imperfect thing, if it's documented and consistent, then it's very easy to go back and correct that. Whereas if it's not consistent, then you're in trouble. And we try to be as standards compliant as possible. And of course, applying OAIS is, we don't really have a perfect handbook, a manual that says this is how you do it. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So about how we structure our APE, SIPs, and DIPs. Our packages, which again, I see the package as really the building block of what we're trying to accomplish. We package at the item level. I know some people will bag at the collection level or at other levels. We package at the item level. This gives us small packages or smaller packages, and I feel like ingesting, say, 100 or 1,000 1 megabyte packages is going to be less risky, less energy intensive, less CPU intensive than trying to ingest single gigabyte package. And so by keeping it at the item level, it allows us more flexibility, and it reduces risk and energy consumption to some degree. Our APEs, this diagram on the right, that's our basic structure of the APE. The yellow part in the middle, that's the item itself, which in this case is an example of some TIFFs that we've imaged in our digital services lab. And then the orange part is the bag, which you all probably recognize the different components of the bag. And then we also include these two CSV files, metadata CSV and manifest CSV. The metadata CSV only contains minimal metadata, like bare bones, what is this thing and where does it belong? And I always say that's in case the thing is, if an object is floating in space, if it ends up in a S3 with a flat file hierarchy, or if it ends up in a, archived by Archivematica and the file name has been changed to a gibberish UUID, we can always take a peek into our packages, look in that CSV, and figure out what is this, where does it go, who's responsible. And in the manifest CSV, that's just an inventory. So we run an inventory on the item, and that captures file size, file MIME type, and some of the date time metadata. It captures a C time, which is tricky because on Linux and on Mac, the C time is the last modified, or it's the time that the metadata was changed, whereas on Windows, the C time is a created date time. Anyway, I'm rambling, getting into some of the nitty gritty, but basically we like to keep it simple, and we like to start simple and then build complexity later. So we just take our items, bag them, and tar them. And we don't use gzipped tars, although I've done that in the past, just because the goal is to not have any compression. Gzip is supposed to be lossless compression, but we just leave it at the tar level. I mean, maybe we'd be open to changing that if evidence comes about that that's not the ideal. As far as minimizing risk, this is just a little table that I threw together to explain some of the risks that we face. So the risk of data loss during processing, we process objects on the same machine where they were created as much as possible. The risk of data loss and date-time metadata being lost during transfer. For physical transfers, we either tar them or zip them up and run fixity checks on both sides of the transfer. And by physical transfer, I just mean whenever the file is going from one machine to another machine, because within the same machine, I just assume that that's going to be reliable enough. Because a lot of times moving something within the same machine is nothing has actually moved. It's just a matter of changing the path to that object. Something going wrong when updating the apes, we store minimal immutable metadata within the apes, and I know this is going to be different from others. Some people are huge fans of OCFL, Oxford Common File Layout, which that involves storing information about the object and about versioning of the object within the object. And I know the Fedora repository implements OCFL, but we only store the most minimal metadata because this way we don't have to ever touch the preservation object in order to update the metadata. So we can update the metadata, we can do whatever we want with all of the metadata in a separate system, and we store that separately in preservation. And the actual packages don't have to be touched, except fixity checks. We process in batches. We try to keep things modular, and we also incorporate these stop or slow down points in our workflows so that humans can check and make sure that things are operating the way they're supposed to operate. And those checks have saved us quite a bit on several occasions, because machines, as we know, only do exactly what they're told to do, and sometimes they get it wrong. What tools do we use? Most of our tools are Python, Python scripts, Python automations. It's open source. It's very easy to go in and read exactly what the script is doing at a glance. And that makes our work repeatable, reproducible, transferable. It's also modular, so we're not using kind of a big monolithic software suite or platform per se to do a lot of our work. Instead, we apply more of a microservices kind of approach where we create automations for repeated tasks. And we have the ability to create automations on the fly if we need to. But I guess the important thing is to have a workflow and have the logic of the workflow down, and then we can plug in whatever tools we need. We could use Python, or we could use Baggett from the command line, or we could use some other piece of software to do these things. Here's the workflow walkthrough. So a lot of our content comes from our digital services lab, where items are scanned, imaged, digitized, and we actually have student employees working in our digital services lab, and they actually run a lot of the packaging workflows, which I think is great. So they track all the workflow processes in our processing log. Each object has its own line on the spreadsheet, and at any point, someone can go in and figure out what stage of the process an item is at. The next step after creation is generating the SIPs, or submission information packages. our SIPs contain the preservation master copies. We don't store camera raw. I know that's a point that people can argue. We don't store the camera raw, but we do create a TIFF that is as close to the camera raw as possible. Let's see. I went over the structure of our packages, and then these packages are created using two homegrown Python scripts. The first one is called D&D prepack. D&D is the name of our department, digitization and digital preservation. And this, basically it just moves items into the proper folder structure that we want, and it generates a CSV that's used to load into the next script, which is called SIPmaker. And SIPmaker runs those processes. So what I've done here is I've taken modules in Python that other people have developed, like Baget Python, and like the tar module, and I've just kind of combined them in a series so that the SIPmaker will go through, it will inventory everything in the payload, it will generate or it'll turn it into a bag, it'll turn it into the whole thing into a single tar file, and it will generate checksums for every file within the package as well as for the package itself. And then when we transfer, we just compare the checksums for the packages before the transfer to checksums on the package after the transfer. This is D&D prepack. You can see it's just very simple GUI. There's just input output folder and some of the CSV information. And then this is what the SIPmaker GUI looks like. Again, just a basic Python GUI. And where it says options, you can see the various processes. It's possible to check certain ones and uncheck ones that you don't want it to do. It's also possible to have it prompt after it does everything. So after each step, it can give you a prompt and be like, all right, is it okay? And that's just there so that we can troubleshoot if something goes wrong, and we can kind of pinpoint where did it go wrong in the process and what's really going on. The radio button down at the bottom, standard versus glacier deep, that is for our, we're members of Academic Preservation Trust, and so there are at least two options for storage in AP Trust. One of them is standard, the other one is Glacier Deep Archive. So that's what that means. After the items have been packaged, they get transferred to our NAS, our Network Attached Storage Device. And from there, our digital preservation librarian accesses them and ingests them into our various locations. So we keep a local copy in Archivematica. We have plans to store our external copy. We haven't fully developed that. We're thinking we'll put the external copy in a LOCKSS, private LOCKSS network called Alabama ADPNet, Alabama Digital Preservation Network. Sorry. And then our third, our geographically distributed, again, goes into AP Trust. And we track everything in this processing log, which is just a spreadsheet. Again, we like to do things low tech because they're not black box, and that we can have more control over what we're doing and kind of track the information that we need without, extra features or whatever getting in the way. And so this slide is talking about the QC. The digital preservation librarian will QC each of the packages, just make sure that the component parts are there, that they're correct. And we have come across issues where in the lab they created packages, they thought they were fine, but the preservation librarian caught some glitches or some mistakes in the workflows, and we were able to fix those. And this is just confirming ingest into AP Trust for one of those three: local, external, geographically distributed. That's all I got.
All right, thank you. Yeah, there are, I got a few questions. Hopefully, yeah, so we'll come back around. Hopefully folks have some questions for you at the end. But yeah, thank you very much. All right, so Dan, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm going to share screen also. Got a few slides here. Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's, well, maybe there's still some morning for some of y'all. So I'm going to talk today about our gray digital preservation repository and the workflows that get us there. Starting out with a little bit of background, where we started to think about this it's almost 3 years ago now since we started to conceptualize this, is that the existing digital preservation repositories we had were not built to handle records at scale. And so thinking about like university archives, where we are accessioning on a regular basis, several times a month, anywhere from a single document to things that could be thousands of documents. And due to the human resource hours it would take to do the type of metadata work that would require that to end up in our repository called the Digital Collections, which is a Fedora Samvera repository, we just have never had the bandwidth for that. And so after years of wanting something different, Terry Reese, our head of digital initiatives, came to me with an idea about how we could maybe do this as maybe kind of a more of a bootstrap operation of getting ourselves to digital preservation for these materials. At the same time, this project provided our developers to begin to practice a bit with Fedora 6, because we are currently on Fedora 4 point something for the digital collection repository. And this would allow us to begin to have familiarity with Fedora 6, as well as the fact that this was at the time we were beginning to migrate everything that we do, almost everything we do, into the cloud using Amazon Web Services. So, while noted is that the initial user is University Archives, I'll also be talking about how we will be expanding beyond that. This in and of itself initially is a replacement for this thing we called the dark archive, very misappropriately, because it was never really a dark archive. It was just a secure FTP server with a lot of stuff on it that we had little intellectual control over. So this is to finally get intellectual control over all of that content. But as you can see, this wasn't just something that we just turned on after we had an idea. After a variety of fits and starts and some issues that dealt with some organizational staffing and whatnot and leadership, it took us nearly 2.5 years to go from concept to actually last fall doing a lot of real hardcore testing and getting us ready so that we were able to launch this service this past January, with the University Archives now actively putting their backlog of things into it. So to provide a bit more context, is that what this gray repository does is allows for our curatorial deposit and retrieval, but no direct patron access. So that's the difference between this and the other existing Fedora instance we have, the digital collections, which actually has that patron interaction based upon limits that are there in regards to access based on rights and things like that. So for the most part, you can see the stuff in the DC. You may be able to even click on a thumbnail, but in some cases you may not be able to retrieve it. But in most cases, you can retrieve it. What we're really thinking about with this is that, we like to consider it, a dim digital preservation archive or repository. It's not light, which is what DC is, but nor is it dark, like say an AP Trust, where you put it there and you walk away from it and you're just trusting the repository to do all the digital preservation stuff and the people that run it, but you never really interact with it. This is actually much more like a physical archival storage facility where you got stuff stored on shelves in an environmentally regulated and well-managed manner. As well as that you've appropriately described it and have it in your finding aids, it's all in conformance with accepted standards. But in those stacks, you do not allow your patrons to wander around there and pull things off the shelves like you would the stacks of an open library, or the stacks, the virtual stacks that is a digital collection, digital repository online where you allow them in and out. This is where it's semi-processed material that you, on the curatorial side, will pull the stuff back and provide it to the patron, whether it has to be, if there's issues of privacy and such, that you might have to put it in a secured reading room, virtual reading room, or it could be downloaded specifically into the reading room and only there, or it could be something so open as that you download it and you share it through OneDrive or their Dropbox or through some form of an external method. So this was meant to address a variety of gaps that we had in our digital preservation environment. One was that we weren't dealing a whole lot with born digital content. There's a little bit of that exists in our digital collection system. There's particularly a comics collection that came to the Bailey Ireland Cartoon Library Museum, and we learned to get that in there, and that was only a couple thousand things. The amount of detail that went into that, we would never be able to do that, say, if you got a comic run for 30 years of daily newspapers. There's no way we would have the human resources to possibly process that in a way that it would be handled in that system where you essentially have item level description metadata. This also then provides us a place for temporally restricted things. So, one of our collecting areas at the University Libraries is the Ohio Public Policy Archives. So we get collections from retiring senators / House of Representatives type people, other people involved in public policy that impact Ohio. But those usually come with 3 to 5 year restrictions. That may even mean processing restrictions. And so we can take those born digital contents that we are now almost exclusively getting from those types of collections, and we can park it here in this repository for that time. And then when that time is up, it can be brought back, it could be processed, and then a decision can be made. Does it go into digital collections with a very detailed metadata description and access approach, or maybe it gets processed, but it goes back into this repository as it's the default place to be. So I mentioned that thing called the dark archive before. About half of the content on there, close to 1 million assets, are things that are the preservation files for what we call the knowledge bank, which is our DSpace institutional repository, which served as kind of a special collections digital repository before we had anything else. So we do have a bit of fragmentation there where some of our special collection stuff is actually in that repository, but their preservation files have existed on this SFTP server for the past 15 to 20 years. So we're finally sorting through that pile of stuff and getting the actual preservation files into the new repository. That's the second set of files that we're moving in there while University Archives has begun to actively use this. And then we might have other digitized content, and we usually think of our digitized content going into that digital collection system, that other repository, that open repository. But there's also a lot of things that we have that are fraught with rights and access restrictions that and especially when we're talking about as we ramp up our audiovisual digitization program, because that's some of the most at-risk stuff, physical media sitting on our shelves. But as we digitize that to help preserve that information and that content, we may not be able to make that publicly available. So this becomes the place to put it. And so the other thing that, as we had approached the design of this thing, I had this notion in my head that when we bring collections in the door, any collection, is that there's some type of a bifurcation where we decide this collection is going to get this minimal processing and go on the shelves and stacks. And at some point in the future, someone may think about processing that more and doing something more with it. But there, another collection may come in and say, well, this is really this cool stuff, or this donor demand or whatever, and we have to process this in detail now and get it out there for the public to consume. But that's not really how we do our work. When I talked with our archival technical services and interviewed them as part of this process, is that most of the things come in the door and they get that minimum level of processing because that's the bandwidth we have, and it goes on the shelves in the stacks. And so that put a different spin on this gray repository as becoming the default repository for anything born digital coming in the door, because it comes in, it gets that minimal processing, it goes there. And if at some point in the future there's a curatorial decision made, it can be pulled back and further processed at that point in time. So some of the components that we have here is that, we're using VPN because we, for a couple different reasons, is one is that it gets us in touch with the Amazon Web Services because they're not on our network, or it might be because we have people working remotely and they need to do a remote desktop where some of our smaller applications are set up there, so that we can have the tools in a specific position. Right now, we have one remote desktop set up, but it's likely we're going to have to set up a variety of those as we bring more people on board with this. We use Droid from National Archives UK to do our, create a manifest of what is there. So we can also do file format identification, create original checksums and things like that. We had started using Abby Fine Reader to do OCR on things that are static images or dumb PDFs, because we have an enterprise license for that, and it's really good at doing the OCR. Then we ran into a problem where there was a number of things that you could look at on a monthly basis, even with that enterprise license, and you couldn't adjust that up. And that threshold was 5,000. And there's no way with some of these record sets that would even get us through that record set. So Terry Reese, our head of digital initiatives, I talked to him about this, and he took Tesseract and trained it with Abby and created essentially a little one-button app called Quick PDF OCR that essentially you put in your file line in that, or your path, I should say. You click the button and it does the OCR for you. Because then what we use that OCR for is to use the bulk extractor tool to be able to test for PII. And we're testing for social security numbers, and we're testing for credit card numbers. So that we do that. And so if we do run into that, we then have something that we use in our checklist of information in our dashboard to do a check that we have something there, so that the curator knows that before they turn that thing back over to a patron, that they're going to have to do some redaction to the records type of thing. So then ultimately we're using Fedora, and we're using version 6 in AWS. Currently we use an S3 bucket to get things to AWS, but we're actually storing it not in S3, and I forget the exact title of it, but it's one of their file storage. We have just met with them within the past 2 weeks, and it's an area where we're going to think we may end up re-architecting that so that it'll actually be stored in S3. And then on the administrative end of this is that currently we're using Microsoft lists and a team, Microsoft team, to administer the administrative documentation, administrative dashboard lists for keeping track of some of the salient details, and then the team to keep track of the fact that we're saving our Droid reports, we're saving our OCR reports, and things along the bulk extractor reports, things along those lines, and we're saving that locally. Partially, we're saving the CSV from Droid because that can be handed over to a patron to do pre-research before we even have to pull back a bag from the repository. And I just look at the screen as I forgot to put Bagger on here, because Bagger is what we're using, is we bag up the content and we drop that to an S3 bucket that goes to Fedora then. And ultimately, our finding aid still is Archivist Toolkit. That's what we're using now. And we've created a field in there for the Fedora ID that we get back. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So this is what our workflow looks like. I know this is probably a little bit tiny, but on each of these slides, and as you can see, if you go to go.osu.edu/gray-repo-wiki, this is there along with lots of documentation, lots of detailed documentation as to how this all works. But essentially, we have a digital processing area set up, which may be that remote desktop, or it may be a shared drive that we have. We're going to start by doing the files manifest and characterization checksums using Droid. And those reports are going to be saved in a folder called accession ingest documentation, which is where we're aggregating that information that is going to also go into the bag, but it's also going to go into our administrative dashboard. Then we have to do the personally identifiable information identification, PII, using those tools I talked about before. And we get a bulk extractor report at the end of that, and that goes into that ingest folder. And then we bag that content, and that content is bagged, including that ingest folder. That's going to go into Fedora. Our developers set up a thing so that once it hits Fedora and ingest is complete, it spits back to us into that S3 bucket a text file with the Fedora ID and the file name. And then within the text of the file itself, the actual Fedora ID. That Fedora ID is then put into the Finding Aid and Archivist Toolkit in a field we've created there, because that will be our access. That is our link between our Finding Aid and the actual objects that are there. That ends the process on that end. We put that information also into that dashboard that we have for now having administrative control over the things that we have in there, unlike what we have with our current so-called dark archive. And so if you had to retrieve something, we go to our gray repo here, web interface. You can see it's the Fedora 6 inventory is what we have here. And this is the extent of the interface. And so we have the bag, we have the Fedora ID, and there's some things that tell us, if it was, going, if you could look at this and if something was going through the process, it would check whether the checksum is done, it's been ingested, or it's in the process of ingesting. We simply copy the number from the Fedora ID field of Archivist Toolkit, and we put it into the find field here, do a Control F, and that will highlight it there. You click on that, and that will download the file, and you bring it back. So it's really kind of rudimentary. It's not very shall we say it's not ready for the Paris fashion show per se, but it's doing the work, and it kind of follows along a bit of a mantra I've been developing about you got to do something as opposed to the nothings. And so this is a something that we've been able to do, cobbling together a variety of tools in-house. There are other things that I'd like to be able to do if we have better bandwidth. I really would not like to use Microsoft List long-term because that's kind of a finicky tool. I'd rather use something else. But the benefit of lists right now is it forces people to put all the information in and not just some of the information. If I were to use a spreadsheet, I'd have no control over the data entry on that. So this is like I say, if you go to the wiki, we have the step-by-step documentation of how we do the ingest process, albeit redacted because there's a variety of things I had to redact from that to meet our cybersecurity standards. And if you like to talk more about this is my contact information. I'm happy to talk to anyone about this and what we've done, and we can always share what we've done further. And I'm hoping that maybe later this year, this will be a poster at a conference. So take a deep breath, and I can turn it over to the next, turn it over to Scott, and then hopefully I have time for questions at the end here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. Scott, what do you think about time?
Yeah, it's almost 1:45, and I really would like people to give a chance to people to ask questions. So if it's okay with you, Eric, and everybody else, maybe we can postpone my presentation for some other time.
Yeah, that sounds good. What do you think, Robin?
Well, depending on how many questions we get, how long do you think your presentation would be, Scott?
I'm thinking mine would probably be about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's
We-
not a lot of time left if people want to ask questions or do follow up.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And we'll it'll be great to have you at the next meeting in September. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
in fact, I mean, I'll just kind of insert a plug for our preservation system here. A lot of people on the call in the Big Ten Academic Alliance have already kind of have seen it, but we built our own preservation system with a web front end and everything, and we're going to be releasing it as open source sometime within the next couple of weeks. So in September, if I talk about it, I can do a little bit more in-depth coverage of it, and code will be available there for people to download and evaluate if they're interested.
Well, that sounds good.
yeah, yeah, sounds good. And it'll be good timing at that point as well. So that's exciting. So yeah, I see that some people have been writing questions in the chat for both Luke and Dan. So why don't we go ahead and open it up, and please either feel free to unmute or write a question in the chat. And yeah, thank you. So I can think of one question off of that for I think for both Luke and Dan. One of the things, and this is actually Luke, when you started talking about the notion that you're bagging at like an item level, and the advantages of doing that versus having gigabytes worth of files within an individual bag, and then upstream when that's happening, like any of the curation or where, like, how is the decision reached, I guess is what I'd like to ask, to go at an item level, and is that a discussion that happened like with other individuals who are working in that who are involved in that workflow, or the depositors? So yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. I've got lots of ideas trying to get their way out of my mouth, so it may sound a little haphazard. Well, I think that to put it in kind of a short statement, it's really a conversation that happens with the collection experts, the collection managers. So a lot of the things that we are packaging and storing, our department falls under library IT more than it does under, in the hierarchy, than it does under archives and special collections. And so for us, it's a relationship between us doing this technical preservation work, which is very much archival in so many ways, and the people who are curating the physical collections. And so just to give an example, well, the short answer is it's mostly determined by the collection managers. They're the ones who are collecting. They're the ones who are experts of those collections. And so they have the most ability to say this is an item, whether that means a folder or an individual. So one of our collections recently is a collection of political campaign pamphlets and posters and whatnot. And I mean, you could say, well, an object is this folder, which contains 10 or 20 actual pamphlets, or an item is a pamphlet, an individual pamphlet, or at the collection level, an item could be, large sections of those. And we We've done it at the very bottom level. Each pamphlet is an item in that collection. But yeah, I don't think there's an easy kind of like, it's this, the end, but it's kind of an ongoing conversation, and it's one that we keep open with archivists, archives, people who are well versed in, the theory, archival theory, because we're not coming to this, fresh. Like, digital items are very much like the physical items. And all of that archival theory about provenance and authority and authenticity and those concepts very much apply to our work. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because the other aspect you mentioned about the metadata being immutable, which I thought was really really fascinating, and it seems like a great approach. It's based on having that kind of like granularity in the objects, and then having the metadata like right next to it, and that's what I mean. That seems to work out really well. But also, like you said, it's an ongoing discussion. I think that happens with us as well, and it happens like at least for UC campuses, like they're trying to do this in different ways. Like each of the libraries is having their own discussion, but there's also some coordination as well, like for their bagger profiles, like they started to develop a standard like Dart profile from the AP Trust like Dart application, which I thought was really interesting, just in terms of all the fields that they want to include and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's always this discussion that's ongoing. But okay, yeah. So thanks for the additional explanation and context. That Dan, I just wanted to ask you really quickly. You had talked about the notion of curators. Just there's that like the bandwidth that people have when an item comes in, or when a collection comes in. That there's only so much bandwidth there, and then something may be ingested and put into the repository, and then there's the ability for curators to possibly come back and work on additional processing. If that is that correct?
Yeah, that would be correct. And like I say, I think the classic example is our public policy archives, where we'll say we had a House of Representatives retire and they decide to donate their collection this week to us. We would likely have a 3 to 5 year restriction on processing those materials. So you'd pull it in, do the basic minimum accessioning of it, and then we would put it in the repository. And then maybe 3 to 5 years down the road, the curator can then go in and pull those back to begin the processing. So that's, I think, is a kind of a more standardized workflow. I think more practically is what we have is just due to the pure limitation we have for processing any materials, because of the amount that comes in, plus the continuing to tackle 30 some year backlog of processing that they started 10 years ago, and we're still trying to keep up with it. Is that eventually there will be a demand. Maybe there's a professor on campus that now understands that material is there and they really want to use that for a class. That may mean that stuff gets pulled out and needs to be more processed and detailed to be used more effectively. And so that might be another reason for doing it. Or it's possible that with some of these things I talk about with the audiovisual digitization that we do, is that you might get to the point where those limitations, those rights limitations have finally expired, and we can actually make them publicly available. And so you might want to pull them out at that point and place them in the public facing repository. So there's a lot of different reasons you could do that. And that's why, like I say, is that I think it was my former boss, Jennifer Vinipol, that started saying something like dim archives, which made me think it was like, well, let's call it gray. We are scarlet and gray for our colors. So, it's a gray repository.
Yeah, so that sounds very familiar with the notion of like taking something back out and processing it, additionally, and then additional uses and possibly make things public, right? So one of the things we've had come up is that like some folks at Library IT on one of the campuses who take care of the main dams for maintaining all of they use Tind and they maintain all of their metadata and everything, and their practices have changed over several years, and so the objects that they're actually putting in our repository now are structured very differently than they were 8 years ago or what have you. So there's this interest of them, of enabling them to, or they're asking, could we go through and restructure some of those objects? Here's a manuscript that has 300 pages. We used to, we currently have one object that has 300 TIFFs in it. Some of our other earlier ones have they're 300 individual objects. It makes sense to have them that way, but maybe we're going to change our minds in the future. And how do you address that? And so right now we don't really have a great way for folks to actually make those sorts of changes, so they can either break down existing objects or compile a bunch into one. And that's definitely a discussion that's kind of going forward, and we'll see what we can do. But it's good to hear that there's a flexibility and there's definitely the use case there, obviously.
And we're even making some of those kind of decisions right now, because some of that content that sits in the old dark archive are digitized brittle books, which we provide access to Internet Archive, possibly also through HathiTrust. But from our perspective, it's like, I don't need the individual PDF pages. If we're going to preserve something, let's preserve that compiled PDF. Maybe the TIFFs along with that. But even then, it's like, these are books where the book still exists on the shelf. And not only that, but in most cases, there's multiple copies of this book. So do we need to preserve? I mean, that's one of the other decisions, in all of this is what is your preservation copy? Is it really something digital, or is there something, audiovisual? I would say yes, that digital preservation copy is your go-to, because you're probably not going to be able to use that original material, at some point in the future. That really will be dead and gone. But I think, if you're talking books on shelves, we're a little better at preserving those things, at least for the next couple hundred years, I would think. So we'll see.
Yeah. And then there's a question from David in the chat here. Can you each talk a little bit more about scale in terms of ingest per month or quarter and the effect on your approaches?
So I don't know that we don't have enough information at this point, because we are just getting started with it. So that I would say in another year or so, we'll have a better sense, because right now part of it is we're working through backlog, as well as the fact that there'll be, and I think once we work through the backlog, there's actually going to be much less that goes in on a regular basis. So that, we've got these, 16 terabytes, nearly 2 million assets that we have to make decisions on, whether they're going to this repository and disposed of or going to a different repository. And we have a backlog that the University Archives has been working through that dates back to 2009, I think. And so they're working through that. But once those backlogs are out of the way, then it'll be a little more, I think, as we get stuff will go in type of thing. It'll actually be less going in there. And I would just note too, is that our bags, we have an artificial limit set on the system right now at 15 gigabytes that our developers put on, because we weren't sure how big we would be getting things. And so then it also kind of, the bigger you get, the harder it is to kind of push it through all the pipelines. So we've capped it at that. So if we do have a super large one, say you've got 150 gigabytes, you probably break that into a minimum of 10 bags somehow. So.
I'll jump in and talk a little bit about our processes and scaling. Our digital preservation librarian, Grayson Murphy, has entered into the chat part of the answer as far as like how much per month. The way I see it, our processes are at a small scale at this point. And I think terabytes is kind of a small scale to begin with. And my overall philosophy is, let's start simple. and build complexity later. And as far as scaling, I feel the same way. Like let's get this nailed down in a very simple kind of small way, and then we can add complexity. We can add more input or more throughput, I guess, as we grow. At the moment, because our processes are very kind of homegrown Python scripts, not proprietary, not a whole platform. They're simple. They're not unsophisticated, but they are simple, so that we're always planning for future us. And we're like, future us is going to come in. They're going to be able to understand what we're trying to accomplish. They're going to see the documentation for it, and they're going to be able to implement new tools if they need them. Larger storage spaces, or maybe some cloud technology, or, you know, like whatever technology comes down the pike, they're going to be able to pick up where we left off and keep moving it forward, because we've got that solid rationale, and we've got it kind of modular and kind of a microservices approach. So I think that it's possible to expand. It's possible to scale up with our current processes, but at the same time, there's capacity. You know, we've talked about, well, what if we had 50 students working in our digitalization lab scanning items? What would that look like? And the answer is, well, we don't want that at this point, because we've got to balance quality with quantity. And we've got to make sure that everything is working well at this level before we can scale up, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think, yeah, Grayson, thanks for adding that note. And yeah, I see David replied as well. So. Okay, we're right at the top of the hour right now, and yeah, thank you again, Luke and Dan, for presenting, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to hear your presentations, and Scott, we look forward to hearing from you next time. We will be having a meeting on September 16th. That's our next date, and we'll definitely send out a reminder and everything, and we will see. Which other topics we try to cover for that meeting. So yeah, we've been going through our kind of like annual topics poll, and this was one of the most popular topics to talk about. So I'm really glad we were able to get together and hear more about ingest workflows and staging areas and how everyone's approaching it. So okay, let's see. I think that wraps it up. Robin, do you have anything else you want to add, or
I just wonder if it might be worth, since Scott's going to present next time, maybe lining up one more to present with him, since this has been such a strong topic. I know it's a conversation here, but I don't think we have things nailed down.
So I'm going to throw out a word of caution is that week of September, that's IPRES week. So just keep that in mind too, that maybe you might think about week before or the week after, maybe rescheduling.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. We will do that. Thanks for mentioning that, Dan.
That's a good pointer.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.